Hello, and welcome to The Mind of a Therapist, a podcast where I interview psychotherapists and helping professionals and what they're passionate about in order to provide you with messages of encouragement and hope. I'm your host, Andrew Earl. The Mind of a Therapist is sponsored by Psychological Counseling Services, healing hearts and transforming lives. Look into our intensive at pcsearl.com. In today's interview, I interview Gary Quan. Gary is an LMFT with over 15 years of experience working to support a variety of couples, families, and groups across cultural and socioeconomic spectra in private practice, community mental health agency, acute psychiatric hospitals, and varied correctional settings. Gary serves as adjunct faculty at the master's level for the University of San Francisco, Holy Names University, Golden Gate University, William Jessup University, Western Seminary, and Samuel Merritt University, as well as post-secondary at San Jose City College and William Jessup University. Gary and his wife have been married for 8 years and dote their 15 nieces, nephews, and godchildren. Gary has personal hopes to make it to every NBA, NFL, MLB, and NHL stadium for his bucket list. So without further ado, here's my interview with Gary. All right, Gary, thanks for taking the time to be on the podcast today. Appreciate it. The first question I like to ask guests is, what's your take on change? How do you view change? How do you view changes happening on the level of the individual, intrapsychically, but also on a systems level, a relational level?
Sure. I think an apropos analogy for change would be that, without sounding too cliche, that change is always happening, particularly not just in the context of individuals, but also the systems we live in. So, for instance, my niece and nephew who I'm visiting here for the holidays, they've moved multiple times in 10 years. And so I imagine it's brought a lot of change, good and maybe not so good. For me, having changed careers twice now in my short lifetime has brought about a multitude of changes. And so I think that juxtaposed to a general observation of humanity is that we don't love change. And so it can often create these sort of tectonic plates of grinding in people's lives, both intrapsychically, but also in terms of our most primary relationships. And so I often, as an existentialist standard, I often remind people that change is almost guaranteed. Even though I know you and I know it's guaranteed, I will just throw in the clarifiers like it's almost guaranteed, so that I don't shock the heck out of people when I remind them during sessions and in groups about that.
Change is the constant in life, isn't it?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No matter how much we resist, and there is an interesting paradox, at least for my journey, and I'm sure for your journey as well, that the more we resist, actually, the more stuff happens that doesn't work for us, to be quite fair.
Yeah. Oh, that rings true for me for sure. And you said you had this is your second career then as a therapist. What was your first career?
I was an IT auditor. So my first job coming out of college was for one of the big four firms, Deloitte and Touche, as a controls assurance administrator. So just a fancy way of saying that every organization operates well with controls, meaning things that keep things running. And so the irony is that I'm in a field where there's not a lot of control in people's lives, and I'm trying to help them. But when I was working for corporate, we'd often do these annual assessments for organizations. So I think in my neck of the woods, one of my famous clients was Foster Farms. So making sure that not the operational side where the chickens become our dinner and lunches, but just that from an IT perspective, things worked, and you didn't have the people that could change your password be the same people that could access the system easily, and those sort of things. So it was pretty boring as I'm describing it, and I discovered through a series of circumstances that it really wasn't meant for me to do, even though the paycheck was very, very nice.
Sure. And what drew you to therapy then?
Sure. I think many of our lived experiences involve us having literally like therapist tattooed on our forehead. So that's been my experience with friends and family for most of my life. But it took a series of events when I was 25, was in a very unhealthy relationship for both me and them. And it turns out that they ended up, I'm looking back at this, many years later, and it still feels weird saying this, but they were using essentially our relationship, her and mine, to get back together with her now husband, and then wanted to continue on with the relationship. And so that was devastating for me, being a young 25-year-old that fell in love rather easily. And then my grandmother died on my birthday in 2000. So that's about 22 years ago.
Mm.
And so that was being the matriarch of our family, that essentially splintered our family system apart for many, many years, until probably 6 or 7 years later, when we first started having really decent contact with my sister's marriage or wedding. And then the other thing was I got laid off twice from,
Mm.
I jumped from doing IT work to doing startup work, and had 2 layoffs in 9 months. And so having these series of losses really drove me into seeking therapy. And so I did my own work with my own person for a while. And one day during one of the layoffs, funny story is, one of my friends said, "Why don't you come to class with me?" And this was a class at a seminary. So this was a Bible hermeneutics class. And I was promptly bored to tears. But when I looked at the catalog, the very first thing I came across was family systems therapy offered by one of the best therapists I've ever met, Wendy Witham. And that was sort of the start of a very long journey that ends, with you and me today. But I found a lot of healing through the therapist, and unloading a lot of stuff that I hadn't been able to look at and process. Especially after my grandmother died, and her being sort of the thread that kept our family together for so long. And it also allowed me to look at my own family system later on with more compassion and more care. And so now I'm sort of like the proverbial fun uncle, or the funkle, for all the grandchildren. But yeah, it's been a
Mm.
super worthwhile journey, but also humbling in the sense of any number of occasions. I think the train could have gone off the rails if I'd made a different set of decisions. So you're talking about changes, that all the changes necessary ended up being good for me when I just leaned into the change as opposed to fighting it tooth and nail.
Yeah. And w- well, thanks for sharing that, Gary. I appreciate the openness and talking about your own journey. And I'd be curious if you're open to sharing a bit about, with in the face of that loss, and what was most helpful for you when you're doing your personal therapy. What, if you look back, what were there any pivotal moments? Were there what was most helpful that your therapist supported you in?
As awkward as it sounds, there wasn't necessarily an intervention, given that I went to see a Korean Christian therapist. So there was a lot of listening, and I imagine, looking back, I hadn't thought about their therapeutic modality, but it probably was very person centered, just keeping the space safe. What it allowed me to do during that time, given that in our line of work, I just came from the Evolution of Psychotherapy conference here in Orlando, and someone mentioned that to be successful, we need to be not in our own heads, more than 10 hours a week, but that we need to be sort of taking care of ourselves in a way that allows us to be present for our patients. And so I think that period allowed me to, with the help of therapy, also with my spiritual practice, as well as having some friends that never abandoned me. I think the attachment sort of redid itself in terms of attaching to people that I see now as like lifelong friends, but also having frankly, just that time away from having sort of an enmeshed family system and spending so much time with everyone, to sort of becoming more independent and having, sort of my own viewpoint as to, this was a grandmother that I couldn't communicate that well with, but she was very instrumental in modeling, generosity and empathy and frankly humor. The funny thing is, the only word she ever spoke in English, from what I remember, was "I don't care." So she was mimicking one of us at a family gathering, and he was plain as day. And just being able to recall the positive memories with grandmother, as well
Mm.
as some of these relationships I was in, just knowing that okay, so I've been spared from terrible circumstances with the dating relationships. But then in this case, I had the benefit of having a present grandmother that was always caring and would make tons of food for me, being, the the only son. And so just being able to grieve without being judged, one is one of the critical things, which I think will lead to some of our questions on the cultural aspect of it. But just keeping that safe space the therapist did, but also, yeah, validating just how terrible this was. Having four losses in such a short time would have driven most people, I think, to self harm or worse. And so I think, so in some sense, I feel very fortunate, to be quite fair, that I hadn't thought about those things, the self harm and self destructive type of behaviors.
Yeah. Well, thanks for sharing that, and yeah, it just speaks to how powerful it is. I know it has been for me personally when I have friends or my own personal therapist that do just hold that non-judgmental Rogerian space, and what a cornerstone that is for all of our work as clinicians is just that acceptance, that unconditional positive regard, and then also I really resonate with your experience of that part of your grieving process with your grandma is holding on to those memories with her that you held dear, that were important for you, her humor, the impact she made in your life. So I'm grateful that you had that experience. That's been really meaningful for me, and encourage anyone who's um, experienced loss to engage in that process of remembering that person and your connection with that person, because I think it's so powerful, and it can be hard to do because we live in such a fast-paced society, and there's
Right.
not that many places for us to grieve. So I'd like to shift to an area of focus for you, the Asian American Pacific Islander community, and could you speak a bit to um, some of the views and beliefs that the PI community has towards psychotherapy and barriers to getting mental health services?
Yes. And the barriers, I'll start there, are quite many. And you may have heard of the term death by a thousand cuts. And I don't think it's necessarily that dire in terms of the way I would describe it, but oftentimes the barriers are self-made. There is a general stereotype of Asians being well off, and the model minority myth, which is a myth. I want to confirm that, but that essentially wealth acts as a buffer, a psychological buffer against suffering. And oftentimes it takes, like we just described, it takes the first loss of a relationship or the first loss of a layoff or a reduction in force, and it often shakes people's belief systems and their coping down to their cores. And I'd like to think of it more as like an epigenetic um, frailty towards things that might cause suffering, and then more of as a I like to sort of nerd out with the field, as I imagine you do, Andrew. And so some of the anecdotal evidence I've seen is I do group therapy for the Meadows, which is nationally known, but they have a Silicon Valley site. And at one point, the census for our agency was 90%, hovering around 90% East Asian, which encompasses, sort of the main Asian groups, Korean, Japanese, Chinese, Vietnamese, and then South Asian, which is a growing group of folks that need more therapeutic support in terms of Indian and among the other dialects with Indians, Punjabi, and so on and so forth. So at one point, 9 out of every 10 of the patients in these groups looked like and acted like me, and which was very somewhat. Someone pointed out, well, that's very much your area in Silicon Valley, but it doesn't meet the other requirements, which is it doesn't reflect the general population, around us. And so and then in my small private practice, for various reasons, I've sort of kept the marketing and advertising a little bit on the down low over the years, because I've really focused more on agency and community work. But what the type of person that's walked through the door often has been AAPI, and primarily having to do with coping with transitions like we talked about, but also sort of this performance achievement maintenance thing. Again, I didn't intend to make that an acronym, but just sort of achieving or maintaining some level of academic or work performance that, frankly, as you and I know, when there's depression involved or crippling anxiety or perhaps psychosis even, that those really sort of knock people off the proverbial road of success. And so that's been an inroads to a lot of my career in the past couple of years, spanning COVID as well. Is that originally I was more interested in doing sort of restorative justice work, working in the jails, doing groups with female inmates, and so what's been sort of always in the professional corner for me has been essentially my people, whatever that acronym applies to, or whatever that applies to. And so what has slowly been a drip has turned more into sort of a heavy downpour of folks that will come in, and they may not have the same concepts down that you and I might have in terms of like psychoeducation or wellness or coping, but essentially it often looks like, uh, hey, can you fix my son? And it's often the son. So, can you fix my son, Andrew? He needs to get back into a place where he can attend UC Davis or to go to Oregon State. And so, without understanding fully that perhaps there are things that are affecting them mentally, but also relationally. And so, it's been a lot of like heavy processing for me as a professional in the family system level, but also with couples, also with individuals, and then primarily LGBTQIA too. That's a few steps behind the other people groups in terms of mental health and wellness and access to reliable resources. So it's been a huge undertaking. I don't pretend to think I'm going to be the LeBron James or the Michael Jordan of the work, but I've just observed anecdotally that that's been a lot of people that are suffering, and even from a religious perspective, seeing a lot of people suffer. I speak at a congregation once a month where a congregant ran off with millions of dollars of donations, and that devastated the church congregation. And so much of my work has been addressing how, one, that's not okay, obviously, but two, how do we recover when someone is greedy and is so geared towards financial means as opposed to spiritual means. And so it's been an interesting journey, Andrew. I didn't intend to do this coming out of grad school, especially. I really had a heart more towards disenfranchised populations, which I still do, and so I just juggle a lot more stuff now. But what seems to be sort of breaking its way through the proverbial door is doing more API work, and I find that to be rewarding and worthwhile when people are receptive to hearing about it. But that also implies that there's a good chunk of people that are not receptive to hearing about it. Yeah.
And have you had experiences where people have not been open to hearing about the API's community's experience?
Yeah, certainly when dealing with folks in the family setting or in the usually like parent-child therapy setting, oftentimes my inroads is usually through psychoeducation around things that make sense to Asian Americans, like the neuroscience, brain stuff. But I find that there's this kind of insidious thing around both comparison, but also competition with other said families in the community or other people in general. That I must raise my son Andrew as the smartest kid or the highest achieving kid. Dr. Dan Siegel kind of joked around about it at a TED Talk a while back, but he mentioned that we're trying to get into the best elementary school, into the best junior high, best high school, and then he ended it with into the best graveyard. And the crowd at Stanford was stunned that he would actually even go there. But that sort of is, as an existentialist, like that, it makes sense that we're trying to hyperachieve and trying to maintain perhaps a lifestyle that the previous generation achieved. But many of us forget that our journeys are very fortunate. Oftentimes, I would dare say they're blessed by universal means, and sometimes we just get lucky, right? So I think keeping that generational stuff, but also maintaining empathy and compassion and teaching love, healthy love, those sort of things have gone by the wayside, and I think that's done an immeasurable amount of damage to family systems in the community. And I've had even students confront me and say, well, this happens with other minority groups. What I would argue for Asian Americans in particular is that the fall from some sort of status is that much more precipitous because of cultural shame and pride. Shame and guilt, but also pride, to be honest. And then not having community resources in case someone is laid off for 18 months or in case someone does suffer from psychosis, which does affect a good amount of our population. So it's not preparing ourselves for the eventuality that stuff will maybe not go our way. You know, my brief story, I had someone that would brag every time they started session with me that they were the number 37 student in Taiwan at some point, and that's a great power ranking. But on the other hand, what they were wrestling with, and we literally drew these two circles on the board, Andrew: connection or work, and they really couldn't see that there was a life where you could have meaningful work without killing yourself or working 110 hours a week, and then connection. And so we spent numerous sessions across several months looking at these two orbs on the board. And what he eventually concluded was that I need to get back to where I was as that top student in Taiwan. So I will find connection some other time. And so, given that I work in a very sort of subacute setting, those oftentimes put people more at risk of self harm, others harm, you name it, hospitalization. And so, that I think the stakes are as dire as other people groups, but I think the denial level, the lack of wanting to look at how deep these issues are in our community, because we're frankly sometimes in competition with each other, can be devastating for those involved. There even was in the Bay Area. I think it hasn't made the news recently, but I still keep on hearing that teenagers, because they cannot cope with the very struggles of not achieving as high as maybe other people expect them to, primarily parents and peers, that they are jumping in front of the Caltrain and permanently harming themselves. And so I'm saying that the self harm anecdotal evidence, as well as the evidence of young people, younger people than you and me, obviously, that are seeking out group and partial hospitalization. It speaks to just a burgeoning amount of people that are suffering needlessly, or not needlessly, but that they don't have a means out towards finding help that, frankly, many of us have been fortunate to be introduced to, like yourself and myself. Yeah.
Yeah, and I know in the slide deck that you sent me, there were statistics on the leading, if I'm remembering right, the leading cause of death amongst young adults and teens and Asian Americans was suicide. This, and I'm hearing that this competition, this drive to succeed, is a big part of that soup. What else is your sense of what and also these barriers to seeking mental health services? Are there other factors that you see as contributing to these suicide rates?
Sure. I think, I'm just now starting to, having been able to work with you and other professionals in the field, like just having the meaningful dialogue at conferences like the one I attended this past week. It does feel that you mentioned soup, right? So I'm a huge soup lover. So, but I think um, some of the other factors that are going into the soup includes, when we say COVID, I don't mean to talk about the medical aspects of COVID, but the inability for folks to manage to stress and also emotionally self-regulate. Oftentimes, I think it's awkwardly ironic that particularly some of our subcultures in AAPI, that where you have the origin of meditative practices, and yet folks that cannot spend more than 15 seconds breathing before they check their phone, or before they look at the screen, or I've heard of too many cases in the community where uh, the screens end up being sort of the childcare, or at least the coping mechanism, until they're ripped away violently per the teenagers or the children, and they often have to have discussions around that. So I do think there's not just patterns relationally within the API family systems, but also societally, where especially in the Bay Area, where it's pretty common, given from what I know of the Bay Area, to have a very difficult time um, doing life together, whether it's working 80 hours a week, or kiddos are playing two sports throughout the year. And so even my Tuesday night private practice, by and large, the 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 7 o'clock people are always late, because it's difficult to get to the part of Sunnyvale, which is where my office is at, from any number of freeways. So I'm saying these things that are outside from a macro level really do affect things. And yet, what oftentimes people say is that you're just not as good as Andrew, or you're not achieving as much as Gary. And so there's just a lack of awareness, or maybe a willing to see that there's other sort of extenuating circumstances that are working against me from making it to practice on time, or doing 3 teams and doing 2 tutors and then going to religious services. So I think that that seems to be problematic, particularly in the Bay Area. But from what I've talked, when I've talked to other people across the country, they see the same stuff happening. Maybe not to the extent that it happens let's say, the Bay Area or Seattle or Vancouver, but it is problematic that particularly with the suicide rates being as alarming as they are, that a parent might take that and say, just don't be like Gary then. You need to do better, or sort of using that as a terrible non-person centered lesson learned, as opposed to saying this is a problem. That maybe if Jenny is also harming themselves, that maybe I need to get better at educating my son and daughters um, on these sort of issues. It's sort of I don't even have there's not a clinical term for it, but I just sort of wanted to give you a good person on the ground type of thing that often gets said is just don't be like those people. Well, who are those people? Those are their families, our communities, our cousins, our communities, basically. Yeah.
Yeah. And another piece I wanted to ask you about was in preparing for this interview, I was seeing the FBI hate crime report from 2019 to 2020. There was a 77% increase on reports of hate crimes towards Asian Americans, and I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on why that is, and then the impact that that's had on the API community.
Sure. It's created, what I've tried to convey in my grad school classes is this notion of not just the modality and the techniques and theories that we live by or abide by, but also creating these safe spaces in our offices, our group rooms, our places of worship, just in the community where, because it has become increasingly more dangerous. I laugh about this now, but my spouse and I, we went and helped our family move from Maryland back to California, which was pretty daunting with all these little kiddos. But we did get a chance to do a side trip in Maryland, and we asked what we thought was a nice couple, to take a photo for us in front of a covered bridge. And immediately one of the spouses says, "How do you feel about your people bringing COVID into this country?" And this was I didn't know whether to laugh or cry or fume. And again, as a kind of a bigger guy, I'm frankly, I don't feel like I'm allowed to fume because I can often,
Mm,
like other stuff. And so I felt, um, at that time, I just tried to diffuse it, but it hurt, and I think that's the part for the greater community. This period has, I think, woken up some old cultural wounds or sort of genetic wounds around, uh, particularly I'm Chinese American, so Chinese not mattering, especially Japanese. We've heard about the internment camp experience for World War II, and so Asians in particular, when we talk about the diaspora of sort of cultural competence, often either are included with their white counterparts or they're often othered into like this third or fourth or fifth category of we're just not going to think about them very much. And so what that's created is, along with the combination of what we talked about earlier, sometimes there is a self-hatred involved, like not feeling like I belong. I literally had one of my students, based off of what was passed down from their parenting, say, I don't want to do my final presentation because I think I'm too ugly to be on camera. And like those messages get internalized, not just within the family system, but from societal standpoint, that we are hardworking, all the tropes, right? We're hardworking, but we are impotent when it comes to impacting civics and law and ethics and things like that, or that we don't matter outside of doing kung fu or taekwondo or those sort of things. So there's been a lot of that. And then I also think, again, I'm speaking only from an anecdotal perspective, but frankly, it's been easier to pick on the old Chinese grandmother or knock down an old Indian woman because they're smaller and they may not fight back. They're taught not to fight back. Whereas with other groups, you might get more media coverage or more revenge tactics. But because a lot of times I think the violence against our communities really goes in line with some of these racist tropes around us being these gentle people that we're not going to fight back. We're taught to fit in and never cause a wave. And so I'm not blaming anyone in particular, but I think that those are just sort of the ingredients in the ugly soup that's been made for us. And so post COVID, what that's created is a lot of folks that are suffering from crippling anxiety, depressiveness that comes with knowing that I don't belong, and that if I don't feel safe in my own family system, and if I don't feel safe at school or my workplace, where are the few remaining safe spaces in American society? And so I think those are the hard questions to consider. And yet I think there's so many layers involved, Andrew, that it often feels like the easiest thing is just to go to my job and do well and get my raise at Google or LinkedIn or Facebook. And so it sort of, I guess, I'm more of a visual person, but it
Yeah.
creates this like implosion of a person's world. And so what I find is that many times in my group therapy sessions, that you see these people realize, oh wait, I'm not the only person that's suffering from this. Wow, I can find companionship and fellowship with other people. And so oftentimes my groups, they originally start off as process groups, but they end up being sort of these nice, welcoming psychoed groups, and but they end up being comfortable and caring for these participants. And so that's been a blessing or a good thing to see it come out of this. But it also raises up old trauma for a lot of folks. I hope that makes sense from this standpoint.
It does, and thanks for sharing that, Gary. I just want to say I'm so sorry to hear about your experience of racism with your family, and I in in supporting folks who are experiencing shame relating to experiences of racism. What advice do you have? What have you found helpful in supporting people with the ramifications of those experiences?
Yeah, I wanted there was a commercial that came on, and of course, I'm not fond of the commercialization of mental health, but that might be a different podcast, Andrew. But there was an LGBTQ Asian woman that created their own Uber service for people that wanted to get rides, primarily from Asian Americans and like big tough people like myself, and so I think like those are my heroes, like people that are actually coming up with solutions. I think what I'm trying to convey in the fortunate settings that I get to operate in, which is the classroom and in congregational settings, as well as my private practice, primarily from the classroom, I'm saying to my non-Asian people, students in the room, that because of the factors you and I just talked about, Andrew, the last few moments, that oftentimes people will go to you guys for therapy, and so please welcome them in with a huge amount of, or maybe an improved amount of cultural competence and understanding the family of origin, but also the culture of origin, and especially acculturation issues. And then the other piece of it, and I'll just say it just briefly, like I don't think Hollywood has done as much favors because again, the very first big movie that came out in terms of it has been Crazy Rich Asians, but I also love more recently there's a movie called Everything Everywhere All at Once, and for someone that processes the world in the way that I do, which many of us I think do, it outlines both the family system struggles, but also the acculturation struggles. And so I think intentionally seeing some of this stuff happen in pop culture helps. Um, like I said, in the classroom, it's allyship. In the congregational setting, what I'm reminding people is exactly those things we just talked about, which is yes, it's okay to try to achieve. Again, there's no one's going to defund you or attack you if you go to UC Davis or Cal Poly or Berkeley, even. But I think to widen out your gaze in terms of what you see in the world and being okay with knowing what you feel and what's happening inside. So it feels like emotions 101, and I'm not diminishing the effort, but it does feel that for a lot of folks, it's almost like opening up a different set of eyeballs to just their inner worlds. And so I think that was one of the points I hammered home in my slide deck, was that just being okay with your inner world, and if it is disturbing or if it is bothersome given past trauma, then go seek help. Go use one of the services where maybe you could find support groups and things like that. And then in the private practice room, I do probably err on the side of doing more psychoeducation around some of the dynamics in place, but also a pragmatism, like not going out past 9 p.m. by yourself. I mean, I know we live in a free society, we live in a nice republic, but there's just often people that In our neck of the woods, Andrew, like there was a serial killer hunting people in Stockton, California for 14 months. And so they would purposely find people that were not in camera view or underneath the level. So you have a lot of this sort of hunting of people. And again, I don't mean to make people more scared than they already are, but I think some of that pragmatism can look like, for some of us younger folks to travel with grandma or with mom and dad. For instance, my sister's going through a divorce this past few months, and so I will be traveling with my mother several times in the next few months. And so we're going to be flying together, and it'll be fun. I'm sure we're going to relive a lot of our family systems moments, but it's really to make sure that my mother isn't wandering a random airport by herself, right? So I think having that community intentionality is going to be a huge thing in the next few years as our population ages. But also, as a positive psychologist, like to have further linkage with our healthy people too. So
Yeah.
it's sort of like a win-win if you think about it that way.
Yeah. Absolutely. And you mentioned their acculturation. Would you speak to the, the difference between acculturation and assimilation and common issues with the acculturation process, multi-generational acculturation, the differences there that people should have on their radar?
Yeah, I'll do my best to explain it in a way that makes sense for your audience. I just drove back here to the house with my niece, and she was so proud to share with me what she knows of man. She's taken a Mandarin class, and so she just was like, blah 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 this, blah 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 that. And I was like so proud of her. I
Cool.
need to tell her once I leave here, but
Mm.
that would be a great example of acculturation, that she gets to be completely who she is in her growing identity, and then but she also gets to try out Mandarin classes. She gets to try out media classes, right? So that'd be a healthier example of my sister and sadly my ex brother-in-law of fostering an environment where my niece could sprout and be themselves, right? Um, Juxtapose that to where I love my mom and dad, and so I don't want to put that out there. But I remember my dad putting a San Antonio newspaper in my hand and saying, "You're going to start reading this, and you'll never get an accent. So I'm going to make sure you read every single page of this San Antonio Express News back and front by the time you get to at elementary school." So sometime between 3 and 5, I was reading sports pages, but I think the idea was like, no one's ever going to make fun of you for your accent. No one's going to talk smack about you not being American enough. So I think my parents are pretty hell bent on assimilating as best as we could, and yet what that didn't prevent was the usual racist remarks. I don't want to recall all of them in one short podcast, but so many of those memories still stay pretty fresh in my limbic system.
Mm.
And so I think the better bet is to, instead of saying I will try to take on aspects of American life, because again, the American diaspora changes from minute to minute, it seems like, especially given the recent political and medical landscapes. But I think just to, I've seen this happen with other BIPOC groups too, that you have folks that are still keeping their, let's say, Latinx backgrounds, the language, the cultural practices, the quinceañeras or African American culture, but then saying, I will do my best to do well in school, but I will also keep the things that matter to me the most. And I think one of my regrets, my professional regrets in this life, I'm surprised there's so few of them, but instead of sending me and my three sisters to Chinese school, because I was dreading it, to be honest. I think looking back, regretfully, I would have benefited from going to Chinese school and keeping my native tongue, right? If anything, to order good food wherever I go, but to be honest, but to keep that link to home.
Yeah.
And so what my oldest sister did several years back was actually visit my mother and my father's home village, and I could see how that uplifted them for years, like years going past that trip. And so I think there's room, and I always use the term emotional or spiritual poverty to talk about, like, we think of things as finite, but I think for this younger generation that is so much like smarter and to me well put together, or at least technology friendly, that we can encourage them to embrace the acculturation aspect of it, but also keeping in mind where they come from, right? And so I think what happens in generational issues is that oftentimes there is a battle between the parents that want to maintain a semblance of culture, in my case, their Chinese culture, and then saying, "Hey, son, you need to go to school and get A's and achieve out of your mind. But when you come home, you're going to be Chinese." And I've run into that example of at school, Andrew, you're going to be Korean or Indian. I'm sorry, at school, you're going to be American, but when you come home, you leave all that stuff at the door. And so sometimes we aren't doing ourselves any favors by not allowing our children to invest in hopefully the good things about being here in this country, not just being here as what I would call psychological H-1 visas, like just being here to benefit and to grow and to get a paycheck. And so that may not feel like something that we can accomplish in a therapy session, but when we do get platforms like this, which you've offered me, I think I want to reassert like it's good for our children to have expansive worldviews that they can have of their own, beyond just achieving reading, writing, arithmetic. Uh,
Yeah.
so if that makes sense. It's sort of like it is sort of a generational thing per like Bowen family systems theory, and I think it's not solvable per se, but I think it can be modifiable if people are open to working.
Yeah, well, that makes sense. And there's more that I could talk about there with you, but we're getting to the end of the hour, and I wanted we before we started recording here, you talked about an acronym you wanted to share with the listeners. Would you mind sharing that and how it relates to our conversation today?
Yes. So part of I did a talk with Newport Healthcare 2 months ago, and so I wanted to leave the audience with. I'm a huge acronym dork, so I call this slide "Pragmatic and Beneficial Ways to Enhance Support for AAPI Mental Health." And so the acronym is value, and so V is validate our people's experiences. We don't want to dismiss them or say, uh, your dad used to walk 5 miles through a snow pile to school, or that in Korea we all got A's, that those sort of things. We want to validate their experiences for the purpose of fending off emotional gaslighting. Okay, so A is acknowledging their emotions, and the benefit is to help them develop their inner world. L is looking actively for support. There's just a wide variety of support groups that people can access now, which is pretty cool, both paid and free. And the idea around this is actually pragmatic to relieve caregivers and family members from supporting them. And a lot of times, our grateful youth will be grateful to reach out to someone beyond the family system because they know the family system is pretty stressed. And then U in the value acronym is understand their origin story. People do want to share their stories safely, and so it actualizes their past trauma, grief, and neglect, and it also allows them to share it with a professional or in a support group setting to where they feel validated. So it's a two prong thing there, two prong benefit. And then the E is embrace the present more. These are your mindfulness meditative practices, but really is to grow their respective distress tolerances. So again, real briefly, value, V, validate their experiences, A, acknowledge their emotions, L, look actively for support, U, understand their origin story. I'm a big comic book fan. And then E is embrace the present more. And I think those, when put together, again, it's not quite a set of interventions that will help someone navigate 11th grade calculus, but I think the idea is to instill some level of hope, validation, and encouragement for the people that might come into our offices, Andrew.
Yeah. And you mentioned hope there. That is a great segue since we're getting to the end of the hour for my last question. But before I ask it, could you share with our listeners if they're interested in learning more about your work or connecting with you, how they can do so?
Sure. I will leave with you. I don't have a formal website per se. I mean, it feels like 2023 and I don't have a website, but that's more of a confession than anything. But I will leave with you, Andrew, an email address. And so if folks want to reach out to you, I have this email address specifically for students and colleagues to stay in touch with me. So I'll do that for you and your audience.
Perfect, and I'll make sure to leave that in the show notes. And then the last question I like to ask guests is what's a message of hope that you'd like to leave the listeners with today?
Yeah. If we think about particularly what I've talked about is a lot is achievement and performance, and so what I call maybe more solid currency. And so what I've been trying to convey to anyone that's willing to listen is that the currency that I think helps sustain us going forward is not going to look like dollars and cents or pesos or ren or those sort of things, but it's going to look more like encouragement. It's going to look more like validation. It's going to look more like uh, this idea of that I matter. Again, we've had this movement of Black Lives Matters, and so I think this idea, if someone can internalize that they matter to someone, even if it's just their therapist or their support group, that can be so valuable for them. But particularly hope, and hope is something that frankly is so overlooked in my culture. And so I do talk about concepts of hope and love in the community, and even one of the things I was doing with my group therapy course was I was trying to convey to them after every session, I love you, platonically, right? I'm not wanting to ask everyone out for a date. It's more, but the sort of bringing back humanity into our work, or bringing more humanity into our work. I mean, who am I kidding? I'm not. We're both humble workers at this field, but I think this idea that I can love you and love the space that we're in, that often gets so overlooked in my culture, but also this idea of hoping beyond the next degree or the next scholarship, but just hoping for today to be okay. Hoping for, one of the, I'll just end with a very heartening case. I'm working with uh, uh, kind of a semi-famous family in the area. And when I asked each person what they wanted, the parents wanted achievement stuff, but the children essentially wanted to go to Disneyland. I'm in Orlando, so they just wanted to reprise all of their childhood stuff with mommy and daddy. And so I think that our youth are way smarter than we give them credit for. And so we need to hear them out. We need to give them hope for some future that they're frankly inheriting long after Andrew and Gary are gone. And so I think hope is one of those things that, again, we can't define it. I'm sure someone more wiser than me can come up with an acronym for it. But I think we can talk about these concepts beyond just the visceral movie screen or television screen. And so I think as long as we can start addressing these things without feeling shame and guilt, I think we have a nice starter path towards the future, if that makes sense.
That's big, isn't it? The shame, I've always viewed shame as this visor blinder that can get in the way of us really reaching out and seeing others and connecting and loving those around us. And I'll have that image of you in my mind of telling your clients at the end of the session, I love you. That is the human component of our work, and that's, in life, how valuable to say that to our friends and family, but also to no matter what our profession is, our colleagues and our clients. And thanks for that message. Thanks so much for being on the podcast today, Gary. Welcome back anytime. I'd love to have more conversations with you, and have a great rest of your day.
You too. Thank you, Andrew. Much appreciated.
Please press the subscribe button, as well as rating and reviewing our podcast. This helps others connect with what you've been hearing. If you have any questions, please contact us at themindofatherapist@gmail.com. These questions will be kept anonymous. I want to thank Eric Price for the wonderful music you hear in this podcast. Additionally, this podcast was created to provide accurate and authoritative information on the subject matter. Although we are interviewing licensed therapists, they are not your therapists. This podcast is not intended to serve as direct medical advice and should not be used as a substitute for direct professional help. It is given with the understanding that neither the host, publisher, guests, or PCS are rendering legal, clinical, or other professional information. If you need a professional, we encourage you to find one. Visit Psychology Today to connect with a licensed clinician near you.